You want to know what my war was about? Forget the maps with the big arrows. Forget the generals giving speeches. I'll tell you what my war was about. It was about my stomach. A hollow, aching, grinding emptiness that was a more constant enemy than any German soldier hiding in a hedgerow. See, they tell you about fighting for your country, for freedom, and you believe it, you do. But out there, in the mud and the rain of Normandy, your world gets awful small. Your country becomes the few feet of dirt in your foxhole, and freedom is just the hope of a hot meal and a dry pair of socks. We were boys from Ohio and Kansas, from Texas and Pennsylvania, and we were always hungry. Sure, we had our K-Rations, and we'd gripe about them, call them monkey meat and cardboard, but we had no idea. No idea what real hunger was until we saw it in the eyes of the men we were fighting. This whole mess, this whole godforsaken war, it crystallized for me not in some heroic charge, but in a quiet, dangerous moment over a trade. A simple trade in the hedgerows. The hunger we had was a nuisance, a grumbling in your gut that you learned to ignore. But for them, for the Wehrmacht, it was something else entirely. It was a ghost that haunted their lines. We started finding them after a scrap. A patch of woods we'd cleared, a field we'd taken. Some of them, the ones who didn't get away, were just kids, younger than me even, and they were so thin. Their uniforms hung on them like sacks. And their pockets, we go through them, not for souvenirs, not really, but to see, to understand. And you find nothing. A few mouldy crusts of this black, heavy bread they called Kommissbrot. You could have used it to hammer a tent peg. Maybe a can of this fishy, greasy meat, schmaltz, they called it. The can would be rusty, and the meat inside always smelled faintly of metal and despair. That was it. No candy, no coffee, no little packs of sugar or cigarettes. Nothing. Their mess tins were clean, wiped spotless by desperate fingers. It made you think. Their world hadn't just shrunk to the size of a foxhole. It had shrunk to the size of that empty tin. All their thoughts, all their hopes, narrowed down to that one question. What will I put in it next? It got to you. You'd look at a dead boy, no older than your little brother, and you wouldn't see a fierce Nazi, you'd just see a starving kid. And a cold dread would settle in your own gut, because you realized that if our supply lines ever got cut, that would be us. That emptiness would be ours. The first time I truly understood what we had, it was after a nasty little firefight in a sunken lane. The shooting had stopped, the air thick with the smell of cordite and damp earth. We were policing up the area, checking for stragglers. I kicked aside some trampled foliage, and there it was, a dull olive-drab box, a little banged up, but unmistakably one of ours. A K-ration box. It must have been dropped by one of our guys in the advance. To me, it was just another meal, but I picked it up anyway. I remember the feel of it. The waxy cardboard was sturdy, reassuring in my hand. It had heft. I cracked it open, not expecting anything special, but seeing it there in that context was like looking at a treasure chest. There was the main unit, a can of something hash or the chopped ham and eggs solid, dependable. There was the accessory pack, the little cardboard sleeve with the 4 cigarettes, the flat, hard candy discs they called charms, the packet of instant coffee, the sugar, the chewing gum. There was a small foil-wrapped bar of chocolate, and there was toilet paper. God, the toilet paper. A single, precious little pack of tissue. It was everything. A whole little world of comfort and industry packed into a box. I just stared at it. This wasn't just food. This was a system. This was a country that had so much. It could ship chewing gum and toilet paper to the front lines. The chocolate bar felt cool and smooth in my hand. I thought about the schmaltzkins we found on the German dead, and for the first time, I didn't just feel pity. I felt a strange, uncomfortable sense of superiority. We were drowning in plenty, and they were dying of scarcity. That's when the bartering started. It was never official, never talked about. It happened in the quiet sectors, the places where the lines were close and both sides were too tired to shoot. A sort of unspoken truce would descend. You'd hear a call, not in German or English, but in a universal language, a hesitant whistle, a rustle in the opposite hedgerow. One of our guys, a Jewish kid from Brooklyn named Irv who had a knack for this stuff, he was the first to try it. He just stood up slowly, his rifle slung, and he held up a pack of Luckies. For a long minute, nothing happened. Then a German soldier stood up, maybe 50 yards away. He was gaunt, his helmet seeming too big for his head. He held up a Luger. My heart was in my throat. This was it. But he didn't fire. He gestured with the pistol, pointing at the cigarettes, then at the ground between the lines. Irv nodded. He walked forward, slow and easy, and placed the cigarettes on a flat stone. The German came forward, his eyes darting nervously back towards his own lines. He placed the Luger down, picked up the cigarettes, and vanished back into the green wall, just like that. No words. It was the damnedest thing. After that, it became a kind of ritual. Not for weapons, usually, but for small things. For food, my turn came a week later. We were dug in along a hedgerow that separated two fields of trampled wheat. It had been quiet for 2 days, just the occasional pop of a sniper rifle. The silence was heavier than the noise. I had a K-Ration chocolate bar in my pocket. It had melted and resolidified a dozen times, but it was still chocolate. I also had a powerful craving for something I hadn't seen in months, real bread. The memory of my mother's fresh-baked bread was a physical ache. I'd heard through the grapevine, the whisper network that ran through the foxholes, that the Germans on the other side sometimes had decent black bread. It was a crazy risk. But the hunger, the boredom, the sheer strangeness of the war made you do crazy things. So, as evening began to settle, the sky turning a bruised purple, I made my decision. My hands were shaking. I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs like it wanted to escape. I held up the chocolate bar, the foil glinting in the fading light. I whistled, a low, two-note whistle we'd started using. For a long time there was nothing, just the buzz of insects. I felt like an idiot, a perfect target. Then a head appeared, a man older than me with a tired, lined face and a thick beard. He looked at me, then at the chocolate. He held up a small, dark loaf of bread. He gestured to the same spot, a shell crater halfway between us. We both started walking. Every step felt like a mile. The air was charged. I was acutely aware that any of his buddies or any of mine could decide we were traitors and open fire. I could see the details of his face now. The dirt ground into the wrinkles around his eyes. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man, a tired, hungry man. We reached the crater at the same time. He looked at me, and for a second our eyes met. It wasn't hatred. It was a kind of weary understanding. We were both pawns in this awful game, both just trying to get through another day. He held out the bread. I held out the chocolate. Our hands touched for a second. His were rough, calloused, cold. We exchanged the items, nodded once, a quick, sharp gesture, and turned away, walking briskly back to our respective lines without looking back. I didn't breathe again until I was slumped down in the relative safety of my foxhole. I unwrapped the bread. It was heavy, dense, rye bread. It smelled earthy and sour. I broke off a piece. It was coarse, chewy, but it was real bread. It tasted like heaven. And as I ate it, sitting in the mud, I thought about that German soldier, probably doing the same with my chocolate bar. I wondered if he had a wife, kids. I wondered if he was thinking about his home, his own mother's baking. The chocolate bar wasn't just a treat anymore. It was a symbol of everything we had that they didn't. It was the fruit of a country untouched by war, a country with factories that could churn out millions of these little luxuries, while its enemies were scraping the bottom of the barrel. Their envy wasn't just for the chocolate or the cigarettes. It was for the system that produced them. It was for the certainty that another box would be along tomorrow. We complained about the K-Rations, but to them it was a king's feast, a glimpse of a world of impossible abundance. That bartering, that dangerous little exchange, was about more than food. It was a moment of pure, simple humanity. For a few minutes we weren't American and German. We were just two hungry men, acknowledging each other's need. And then it was over. The next morning, the shelling started again. The war came back. I never saw that German soldier again. I don't know if he survived the next attack or if I did. But I've never forgotten his face, or the strange kinship I felt in that silent trade. That's the thing they don't tell you about war. The big moments are a blur of fear and noise. But the small, quiet ones, the ones that happen in the spaces between the fighting, those are the ones that stick with you. They're the ones that tell you what it was really like to be there, in the mud, with an empty stomach and a heart full of confusion, just hoping to see home again. That K-Ration box, that simple piece of American logistics, was a lifeline, a currency, and a stark, brutal lesson in the inequality of war. We were envied, and in that envy we finally understood how lucky we were, and how terrible our luck had to be for us to be there at all. The jump light flicked from red to green, and the rush of cold air hit you like a physical blow, and then you were out, tumbling into that screaming darkness over Normandy. The world was just noise and wind, the sky lit up with tracers that didn't look pretty anymore. They looked like things that wanted to tear you apart. You're praying your chute opens, and when it does with that sudden, heart-stopping jerk, the silence is almost worse because now you can hear it, all the crump of flak, the rattle of machine guns, and underneath it all, this awful moaning of the wind in the shrouds. You're not a soldier anymore up there, you're just a target dangling under a silk canopy. And then the ground comes up too fast, always too fast, a smack of pain as you hit something, a field, a tree, the roof of some poor Frenchman's house. I came down in a flooded meadow, the water ice-cold and soaking me to the bone the second I landed. I had to struggle like a madman to get out of my harness, the silk collapsing around me like a shroud, trying to pull me under. And then silence. Not true silence, because the battle was raging maybe a mile away, but my own personal silence. Alone. That's the feeling that sticks with you, that cold claw of isolation gripping your guts. You're trained to stick with your stick, your buddies, the men you trained with for over a year, and in the space of 5 minutes you've lost them all. The plane's gone, the voices are gone, all you have is the weight of your gear and the dark. My first thought wasn't for the enemy, it was a checklist drilled into me. Find a weapon, find your unit, find sustenance. I'd lost my leg bag in the drop, probably sinking into that damn marsh, so all I had was the .45 on my hip and the few things in my pockets. I fumbled for the standard issue, the hardtack and the chocolate, the stuff we were supposed to live on. It was a pitiful handful, and my stomach, tight with fear and cold, already knew it wouldn't be enough. Not for what was coming. That's a special kind of fear, you know, the kind that's practical. You can be brave about facing the enemy, but your body's needs, they're a coward. They don't care about bravery, they just scream for fuel. And mine was screaming already. So I started moving, keeping low, every shadow a German, every cow in the field a potential sentry. The crickets had stopped. You learned to listen for that. The only thing worse than the sound of gunfire was the absence of it, because that meant something was wrong. I must have wandered for an hour, maybe two. Time gets funny when you're that scared. My fingers were numb, and I kept checking the action on my pistol, a useless gesture but something to do. Then I saw it, a darker shape against the gloom, slumped in a field like a dead animal. It was a glider, one of ours, a Waco. It must have come in too hot, the nose crumpled like a discarded beer can, the wings snapped off. A part of me felt sick, thinking about the boys inside. But the survival part, the part that was just an animal, took over. That glider was a treasure ship. It was carrying supplies, and supplies meant a chance. I approached it like it might be booby-trapped, my heart hammering against my ribs. Inside, it was a mess of splintered wood and torn canvas, and sure enough, there were boys who hadn't made it. I said a quick, silent prayer for them, a habit you never lose. Then I saw the green boxes, dozens of them, spilled from a broken crate. K-Rations. I'd seen them in training, but we never got them. These were for the real thing. I snatched one up, my hands shaking so bad I could barely tear the waxed cardboard. The smell that hit me, God, I can still smell it now. It wasn't just food. It was a smell from another world, a world of factories and efficiency and maybe, just maybe, a world that gave a damn. It smelled of waxed paper, of coffee grounds, of something that wasn't despair. Inside, it was like a little Christmas morning. Neat, organized. A can of stew hard biscuits that weren't like our tooth-breaking hardtack, a little tin of cheese, a packet of cigarettes, Lucky Strikes, and 4 Hershey bars. Real chocolate. Not the bitter, coarse stuff we got that was supposed to fuel you. This was candy. I tore open a chocolate bar and shoved it in my mouth, and the sugar hit my system like a bolt of electricity. It was the first sweet thing I'd tasted in days, and it wasn't just calories, it was a message. A message that said, "You are still a man. You deserve something good." I crouched there in the wreckage of that glider, surrounded by the evidence of war, and I felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it almost knocked me over. It was a gift from heaven, delivered by a dead pilot in a broken bird. I stuffed my pockets, my tunic, every square inch I could find. I wasn't just carrying food, I was carrying hope. It wasn't long after that I heard a twig snap. I froze, my hand going to the .45. Then a low whistle, the recognition signal. I whistled back, and out of the hedgerow came 2 figures, just as lost and scared as I was. It was Schmidt, a kid from Milwaukee, and old man Henderson, who was probably 30 but seemed ancient to us. Their eyes were wide with the same terror I felt. "You got anything to eat?" Schmidt whispered, his voice cracking. He was just a boy. And I remember the feeling, the sudden shift from being a scavenger to being a provider. I pulled out a K-Ration box, the green cardboard now the most beautiful thing in France. "We hit the jackpot," I said, and I've never seen relief like that on a man's face. We found a shallow ditch, a scratch in the earth that would have to serve as a foxhole, and we feasted. We used our bayonets to pry open the cans of stew pork and beans. It wasn't, we ate it cold, right out of the tin, passing it around. We didn't need a stove, didn't need to make a fire that would give away our position. Everything was right there, self-contained. The coffee was a powder. You just mixed it with a little water from your canteen, and it woke you up better than any lecture from a sergeant ever could. As we ate, huddled together in that hole, the dynamic changed. We weren't three lost paratroopers anymore. We were a unit. That shared can of stew, that Passidaron cigarette, it was a pact. We were in this together. Henderson, between bites of a biscuit spread with that cheesy goo, started laughing a little. "Will you look at this?" he said, holding up the little packet of toilet paper and the gum. "They think of everything. The damn Americans, they've got this whole war figured out in a little box." And he was right. We started talking about the German packs we'd trained with, the ones we were supposed to envy. Canned meat, black bread, stuff that needed cooking, that was heavy and cumbersome. This K-ration was light, compact, and it required nothing from you but teeth and a little bit of moisture. It was food for a man on the move, for a war that didn't stop for meal times. It was a revelation. We were fighting an army from the past, and the Americans, for all their greenness, they were equipped for the future. That little box was proof. The next 48 hours were a blur of terror and exhaustion. We linked up with a few more stragglers, a handful of us trying to hold a crossroads against God knows what. Sleep was a memory. Your body runs on pure nerve, and eventually the nerve starts to fray. Your hands shake, your vision gets blurry, your mind starts playing tricks on you. That's when the K-rations became something else. They became a tool of war, as vital as a clean rifle. In the lulls between firefights, when the fear was a cold stone in your belly, you'd force yourself to eat. A piece of that chocolate, a biscuit. The physical act of chewing, of tasting something that wasn't just fear, it grounded you. It steadied your hands. The caffeine from the coffee and the sugar from the candy were a drug, the only kind we had, and they kept you alert for those precious few seconds that might mean the difference between life and death. I remember during one attack, a kid next to Mekadant had been more than 18 was crying, just sheer terror. I didn't know what to say, so I just shoved a Hershey bar into his hand. "Eat that," I told him. He did, mechanically at first, and then I saw him calm down just a little. The sugar, the normalcy of it, brought him back from the edge. It was a small thing, but in war, small things are everything. I think about that often, you know, how we envied the Americans that day. It wasn't a grand envy of their factories or their resources. It was a simple human envy. Their high command, somebody back in Washington, had thought to put candy and coffee and a decent meal in a box for their boys. Somebody had thought, "These men will be scared, they'll be tired, they'll be far from home. Let's give them something that reminds them they're human." Our own stuff, it kept you alive, barely. It was fuel. The K-ration was a comfort. It was a taste of home, or at least a taste of a home that cared. When you opened that box, you weren't just a number in a machine. You were a man sitting down to a meal, however strange. You had your cigarettes, your gum, your little square of toilet paper. It was civilized in the most uncivilized place on Earth. By the time we finally linked up with our main force, a couple days later, I was a different man. I was thinner, dirtier, and I'd seen things no man should ever see. But I'd survived. And a part of that survival, a big part, was because of those green boxes we'd scavenged. I kept one empty box, tucked it in my pocket as a lucky charm. A silly superstition, but you cling to anything out there. When the war was over, and I finally got home, I found that box again, crumpled and faded, at the bottom of my footlocker. I didn't show it to anyone. How could I explain it? How could I tell my family that a piece of cardboard was as important to me as my rifle? That the taste of a Hershey bar in a French ditch was a more powerful memory than the sound of artillery? They wouldn't understand. But you, listening to this, maybe you can. War isn't just the big battles and the grand strategies you read about in the history books. It's the cold, the damp, the empty feeling in your stomach. It's the bond you form with another man over a shared can of stew. It's the small, desperate hope you find in a gift from a dead man, a gift that tells you that you might just make it through the night. That's what was in those K-Rations. That's what we envied. It wasn't the food. It was the hope. You want to know why we envied them? It wasn't just the tanks or the planes, the endless streams of trucks. Any fool could see that. No, the real truth, the gut punch, came in a little waxed cardboard box. A K-Ration. It sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? To have survived Stalingrad, the retreat from the Dnieper, only to be undone by a piece of American chocolate. But that's where you finally see it, clear as day. That's where the war was really lost. Let me tell you, it starts with the cold. A cold that gets into your bones and sets up shop. A cold that makes your teeth ache and your fingers turn white and clumsy. This was Russia, winter of '43, the long retreat. We weren't soldiers anymore, not really. We were a mob of frozen, starving ghosts in filthy Feldgrau. The word ration became a joke, a bitter word we'd spit out. A ration meant a thin slice of black bread, hard as a brick. You had to soak it in your coffee or soup just to get your teeth into it, if you had any soup, which most days you didn't. Our stomachs were just this constant hollow ache, and out of nothing that gnawed at you day and night. You dream about food, not fancy food, just a plain potato, a real potato, hot and mealy. I saw men, good men, hardened Eastern Front veterans, break down and cry over a moldy crust of bread. I saw a lieutenant trade his officer's dagger, a beautiful thing his father had given him, to a farmer for a sack of turnips. We were that desperate. Discipline. It melts away like snow on a stove when hunger takes over. You stop thinking about the fatherland, about the Führer, about anything except the next thing you can put in your mouth. We'd boil the leather from our cartridge pouches, trying to make some kind of broth. You'd chew on it for hours, this tasteless, rubbery stuff, just to trick your stomach into thinking it was getting something. The hunger changes you, turns you into an animal. You'd see a dead horse on the side of the road, and it was like finding a treasure chest. Men would swarm over it with their knives, cutting away strips of meat while it was still warm, the blood smeared on their faces. You felt no disgust, only a fierce, possessive jealousy for whatever chunk you managed to get. The smell of that horse meat roasting over a tiny, hidden fire was better than any perfume. That hollow feeling, that's what I remember most about Russia. The cold was bad, the Russians were worse, but the hunger was a constant companion, a silent enemy inside you, eating you from the inside out. You'd look at your buddies and see their faces getting thinner, their eyes getting bigger and more vacant. They'd just fade away, some of them not from bullets but from sheer emptiness, and you knew you were looking at your own future. Then fast forward to Normandy after the breakout. The world had turned upside down. We were falling back through the hedgerows, disorganized, beaten, just trying to survive another hour. And then we saw them, the Americans. They moved like they were on a field exercise, not a war. Their uniforms were clean, their faces were full. And the waste, Gott I am Himmel, the waste. We were hiding in a copse of trees, watching a column of GIs resting on the road. One of them, a kid who couldn't have been more than 18, finishes eating from his little box. He's got a cigarette dangling from his mouth, and he just tosses the box, with half its contents still inside, into a ditch. He just threw it away. I felt a physical jolt, like I'd been punched. My buddy, Klaus, next to me, he let out this low growl, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. Half a ration. Just tossed aside. In that moment I wasn't thinking about tactics or strategy. I was thinking about Hans, my friend who froze to death outside of Kharkov, who'd been begging for a scrap of food for days before he went. I was thinking about what he would have given for that half-eaten box, what any of us back in Russia would have done for it. We would have fought each other for it, killed for it. And here this boy was, throwing it away without a second thought. The envy was a hot, sour taste in my mouth. It wasn't just the food, it was what it meant. It meant his belly was full. It meant he had so much he could afford to waste it. After they moved on, we scrambled down to that ditch like rats. The box was a marvel in itself. The cardboard was waxed sturdy, it kept the rain out. Ours came in paper that fell apart if it got damp. Inside was a treasure trove. There was a little tin of something, I think it was ham and eggs, and it opened with a key. A key. We didn't have keys for our tins. We used bayonets and hammered them open, usually spilling half of it. There were crackers, not hardtack that could break a tooth, but soft, salted crackers. And the cigarettes, Chesterfields. They were properly sealed in a foil pack, dry and fresh. Our cigarettes, when we got them, were usually a soggy, crumbling mess. But the real kicker was the chocolate. It was D-bar, they called it. I broke off a square and it was smooth, sweet, melting on your tongue. It tasted like peace, like a world without war. Our chocolate, Coca-Cola, was bitter, gritty, packed with caffeine to keep you awake. A tool, not a treat. This American chocolate was a reminder of a life we'd almost forgotten. Sitting there in that French ditch, hiding from the Jarbos, sharing that captured K-Ration with Klaus, was one of the most humiliating and enlightening moments of the war. Let me break it down for you, this practical comparison. It's the little things that break you. Take the coffee. In a K-Ration, you had instant coffee, a little powder in a packet. You just added water, hot or cold, and you had a halfway decent cup of coffee. Our coffee was this awful ersatz stuff made from roasted barley or chicory. It was bitter, thin, and it did nothing to warm you up inside. It just reminded you of what you didn't have. Their crackers, like I said, were edible. Ours, our nekebrat, you could have used it to shingle a roof. You'd have to pound it with the butt of your rifle to get it into pieces small enough to soak. And the sweets, my God, the sweets. They had these little fruit bars or hard candies called charms. A tiny burst of sugar, a taste of something normal. We had nothing like that. Nothing. The closest we got was a spoonful of disgusting, grainy jam if we were lucky. Eating that K-Ration, I felt more nourished, more like a human being than I had in months on our own official rations. Irony was so thick you could cut it with a bayonet. The enemy was feeding me better than my own country. And that was the final, crushing realization. The K-Ration wasn't just a meal. It was a symbol. It was proof. We'd been told we were the master race, the superior soldiers, that our would triumph over their material wealth. But sitting there, feeling the energy from that food actually warming my body, I knew it was all a lie. We weren't just outgunned. We were outstripped in every conceivable way. That little box represented the entire American war machine. It was efficient, it was plentiful, it was designed with the soldier in mind. Ours was sparse, poorly made, an afterthought. It told you everything you needed to know about which nation actually valued the lives of its men. The American soldier was a well-fed, well-supplied machine. We were cannon fodder, starving in the mud for a cause that had already abandoned us. The war wasn't lost on the battlefield, not really. It was lost in the factories of Detroit and the farms of the Midwest, where they could produce not just enough, but more than enough. It was lost the moment that American kid could throw away a half-eaten meal without a second thought. That's the truth I carry with me. Not the strategy, not the glory, but the taste of that chocolate and the hollow ache in my stomach, and the knowledge that we never stood a chance. The weight of my aid bag never got any lighter, even as it emptied. That was the funny thing. You'd think with every bandage you used, every sulfur packet you tore open, it'd be a relief. But it was. It was a clock winding down. Each gauze wrap, each precious drop of antiseptic was one less thing I had to keep a guy from slipping away. And in the mud and the screaming chaos of a field hospital or a hastily dug aid station just behind the line, that bag was my whole world. It was my hope and my damnation, all in one canvas pouch that always smelled of dried blood, iodine, and that faint, metallic scent of fear. We didn't have much, see, not really. Morphine was like gold, and you hoarded it for the worst cases, the ones where a guy was so torn up you knew all you could offer was a one-way ticket to a painless darkness. But you know what we did have? What became more valuable than I ever could have imagined back in basic training? Those little green boxes, the K-Ration. For you fellas, it was just chow. For me, it became something else entirely. It became a tool, a comfort, a bartering chip, and sometimes a last bit of grace for a dying man. I remember the first time I truly understood its power. It was in the hedgerows, just a hellish tangle of roots and German machine gun nests. We pushed through a patch of woods and got chewed up something awful. I was crawling on my knees in the muck, the damp earth soaking through my trousers, the smell of cordite and wet hay thick in the air. I found a kid, couldn't have been more than 19, from the 101st. His leg was a mess, just a pulpy, bloody ruin below the knee. He was shaking like a leaf in a hurricane, going into shock, his eyes wide and unseeing, just staring up at the grey French sky. I got a tourniquet on him, tight, the rough canvas biting into his thigh, and I held his hand. "You're okay, buddy, you're okay," I kept saying, but the words sounded hollow, useless. He was cold, his skin clammy, Shock. I'd seen it 100 times. Then I remembered. I fumbled in my pocket, past the bandage scissors and the roll of tape, and my fingers closed on a small, flat bar. It was the ration chocolate bar from my morning K-ration. I broke off a square, the hard snap of it oddly loud next to the distant crump of mortar fire. "Here, son," I said, my voice softer now. "Have some of this." I put it to his lips. He didn't want it at first, but I nudged it gently. He took it, and his tongue, dry and cracked, moved against my fingers. He sucked on that bit of chocolate, and I watched something change in his eyes. The sheer animal terror receded just a little. The sugar hit his system, a tiny spark of warmth and energy in a body that was shutting down. His breathing slowed, became less of a ragged gasp. He looked at me, really looked at me for the first time. "Tastes like home," he whispered, and then he passed out. But he was stable. That little piece of chocolate, that simple, sweet thing, had done what my words couldn't. It had anchored him back to the world of the living, if only for a moment. That's when I started my secret stash. I'd trade my ham and eggs loaf to any guy who'd take it for the sweets and the coffee from his ration. My buddies thought I had a hell of a sweet tooth. They didn't understand. I was stocking an arsenal of compassion. It became a kind of economy, see, a barter for life itself. There was this one time, after a brutal push near St. Lo, the field was littered with wounded. We had 2 medic teams, and we were all running on fumes, on coffee so strong it could strip paint, and on that nervous energy that keeps you going long after your body has given up. The stretcher bearers, God bless those brave, exhausted men, they were done. Their muscles were jelly, their hands raw from carrying the weight of broken boys for hours on end. I found a pair of them slumped against a shattered stone wall, their faces grey with fatigue and dust. They just shook their heads when I pointed to a groaning form out in a crater. "Doc, we just can't make another trip. It's hot out there." I understood. I truly did. But that guy out there wouldn't last much longer. So I reached into my bag, past the medical supplies, and I pulled out 2 little cardboard tubes, K-ration coffee, and I had a couple of cigarettes, the ones that came in the pack, Lucky's usually. "Look," I said, my voice low and steady. "I got the best damn coffee you'll taste this side of the Atlantic, and a smoke, it's yours. Just get that kid back here." Their eyes, dead with tiredness just a second before, flickered with interest. It was a gesture. It was a recognition of their sacrifice. It was a bribe, plain and simple. They looked at each other, nodded, knocked back the gravelly coffee powder straight from the tube, swallowed it down with a swig from their canteens, and hoisted that stretcher one more time. That coffee and those smokes bought a life that day. And it wasn't just our boys. That was the funny thing about it all. Pain doesn't have a nationality. Shock feels the same in any language. We take prisoners, Germans, some of them just kids themselves, hollow-cheeked and scared witless, wearing a uniform that was too big for them. Some of them were wounded bad. The rules said I had to patch them up, same as our guys. But try telling that to a bunch of GIs who'd just seen their friends cut down by men in those same grey coats. There was tension, hatred. I felt it too, a hot, bitter knot in my stomach. But then you'd look at them. A boy crying for his mutter, his leg bent all wrong. And he's just a kid. So I'd go to work. Sometimes they'd fight panic, not trusting this enemy medic. I couldn't talk to them, didn't speak more than a few words of German, but I had my stash. I'd hold up a can of that ham and cheese spread or a piece of chocolate. Their eyes would get wide. Hunger is a universal language. It was a peace offering, a signal. I'm not going to hurt you. I'd trade them that food for their cooperation, for them letting me set a bone or clean a wound. Sometimes the intel officers would ask me to sweeten the pot, get information. "Give him the chocolate, Doc, see if he'll talk about troop movements." I hated that. It felt dirty. But sometimes a wounded, scared kid with the taste of American chocolate on his tongue would murmur a few things, a village name, a unit number. It was a heart-wrenching trade, their dignity for a full stomach. But other times it was just a trade for their humanity and for mine. It was a way to remind myself that the monster in the propaganda poster was just another poor bastard caught in the gears of this terrible machine, same as me. The moral weight of those little transactions was heavier than any crate of ammo I ever carried. In that moment, passing a cigarette to a frightened German boy, we weren't enemies. We were just 2 men acknowledging the profound, stupid waste of it all. Then there were the times when the medicine ran out. When all the bandages and all the sulfur and all the morphine in the world wouldn't be enough. Those are the moments that stay with you in the quiet of the night, even now, 60 years later. You remember the ones you saved, sure, but you remember the ones you lost with a clarity that cuts like glass. I came upon a sergeant from Texas, a big, tough son of a gun who'd always had a joke for everybody. He was lying against a tree, his gut ripped open. I didn't even have to look close to know. The smell, the awful, sweet-written smell, told me everything. His eyes were open and they were clear. He knew the score. The morphine was long gone, used on men who might have a chance. All I had was my presence and my bag of tricks. I knelt down in the dirt beside him, the sharp smell of pine needles and blood filling my nose. "Hey, Sarge," I said, my voice thick. He just looked at me and a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Doc," he breathed, a wet, ragged sound. "Looks like I bought a one-way ticket, huh?" I didn't lie to him. There was no point. I just put my hand on his shoulder. "Is there pain?" I asked. He nodded, just a tiny movement. I looked in my bag, no morphine. I felt a wave of guilt so powerful it almost doubled me over. Here was this brave man, and I had nothing to give him. But I had my stash. I fumbled for a pack of cigarettes from a K-Ration. I pulled one out, my fingers trembling, and put it between his lips. I struck a match on the heel of my boot, the sulfur flare bright in the twilight, and held it to the end of the cigarette. He took a long, deep drag, the ember glowing orange in the gathering dark. He let the smoke out slowly, a sigh of relief that was about more than just nicotine. "Best damn smoke I ever had, Doc," he whispered. And we just sat there for a few minutes in silence, listening to the war rumble in the distance. He smoked that cigarette down to the filter, and when he was done, he closed his eyes. He was gone before I could even stub it out. That cigarette was everything I couldn't give him. It was comfort. It was a moment of peace. It was a last small pleasure in a world that had taken everything else from him. I did the same for them, too. For the enemy. I remember a young German officer, blonde hair matted with blood, propped up in a ditch. He was trying to be stoic, but his hands were shaking. He was maybe 25. He had a chest wound and it was bad. He was breathing in short, sharp gasps, each one a fight. He watched me approach, his eyes wary, expecting God knows what. I had no morphine for him either. I just sat down in the mud opposite him. I didn't say a word. What was there to say? I pulled out my last pack of Lucky Strikes. I took one for myself and offered one to him. He hesitated, then nodded. I lit mine, then leaned over and lit his, the two flames touching in the space between us. We smoked in silence. The only sound was the crackle of the tobacco and his ragged, struggling breath. After a minute, he reached into his tunic with a trembling hand. He pulled out a small, creased photograph of a woman and a little girl, holding it out for me to see. His eyes were full of tears. I nodded, and I smiled, the best smile I could manage. I pointed to the picture and gave him a thumbs up. He understood. He smiled back, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes for just a second. Then his face went slack. The cigarette dropped from his fingers into the mud with a faint hiss. He was gone, and I sat there with my own smoke, finishing it, sitting with him so he wouldn't have to die alone among strangers. Those acts, they had nothing to do with sides, with who was right or wrong. They were about the one thing they couldn't take from us, our basic human decency. It was about refusing to let a man cross over into that darkness without a final shred of kindness to hold on to. For all the good they did, though, those little green boxes couldn't work miracles. That was the frustration that ate at you. You could give a man a sugar rush. You could warm his belly with coffee. You could calm his nerves with a smoke. But you couldn't put his arm back on. You couldn't stitch his intestines back together. You couldn't stop the bleeding when an artery was severed. I'd be there, handing out pieces of chocolate like some macabre Santa Claus, and just feet away, a surgical team would be working in a frenzy, their gloves slick with blood, their faces grim, trying to piece a human being back together with thread and hope. And the screams, you never forget the screams. A man screaming for his mother, for God, for the pain to stop. And I'd have a secret stash of delicious, real coffee, the good stuff from the Red Cross packages, hidden away, and the guilt of that would crush me. Why did I deserve this small pleasure when that man was experiencing agony I couldn't even comprehend? The irony was a bitter pill. The K-Ration was a symbol of the immense gap between what we could do and what we needed to do. We could offer small mercies, tiny comforts, but we were powerless against the vast, industrial-scale cruelty of the war itself. It was like trying to bail out the ocean with a thimble. In the end, that's what it was all about. The war was this big, ugly thing, this monster that chewed up landscapes and lives and spit them out. And we were just little specks in it. But in the midst of all that, we had choices. We could let the monster take our humanity too, or we could fight to keep it, one tiny act at a time. My secret stash was my way of fighting. A piece of chocolate was a bullet against despair. A cigarette was a salvo against loneliness. A cup of coffee was a treaty in the endless war of attrition on the human spirit. The German soldiers, the ones we took prisoner, they'd see us with our K-Rations, and yeah, I think they envied us. Their rations were awful, I heard, black bread and sausage that you could sole your boots with. But they weren't just envying the food. They were envying the system that could produce it, the supply lines that, however tenuous, stretched all the way across an ocean. They were envying the wealth, the might. But what they couldn't see, what maybe even some of our own guys couldn't see, was the other thing it represented. It was a tiny, tangible piece of hope. And in my hands, it became a weapon of mercy. It was never about the chocolate or the coffee or the smoke. It was about the hand that offered it. It was about looking into the eyes of another human being, whether he was from Milwaukee or Munich, and saying without words, I see you, I see your pain, and this is all I have to give. It wasn't much. But in a world gone mad, those small, green boxes were a reminder that kindness, however small, was a currency that never truly ran out. The silence after a battle, that's a sound you never forget. It's heavier than the noise somehow. The shelling stops, the machine guns quit their chattering, and for a minute there's just this, ringing in your ears, and then this awful, thick quiet that presses down on you. It's more haunting than all the hell that came before it. You'd think you'd be grateful for the quiet, and part of you is, I suppose, but the other part knows what it means. It means the job isn't done. The officers would call it policing the battlefield. That's a clean military phrase for a filthy, god-awful business. For us, the grunts, it meant spreading out in a loose line, walking slow through the churned-up mud and craters, checking the fallen. It was a job that required a certain numbness, a mechanical way of moving. You had to shut off the part of you that was still a human being, the part that got sick at the sight of what high explosives do to a body, and you just functioned. Like a machine. Look for movement, listen for moans. But mostly you learned not to look at their faces. A face, that's a person. A man with a name, a mother, a sweetheart back in Milwaukee or Munich. If you looked at the face, you'd never get through it. So you looked at the gear. You focused on the pockets of a tunic, the strap of a helmet, the way a boot was laced. Anything to keep it detached, to make it just a task, like picking up litter. The smell, though, that got everywhere. Cordite and burnt earth, the coppery stink of blood, and underneath it all, the first sickly-sweet hint of what the sun does to the dead. That smell clung to your uniform, your hair, the back of your throat. You detaste it for days. We moved through that field like ghosts ourselves, my buddies and me, hardly speaking, just a grunt or a nod. Every so often, someone would find one of ours still breathing, and a low whistle would bring the medics scrambling. But mostly it was just the dead. And then I saw him, an American, lying curled up near a shattered log, as if he'd just laid down for a nap. His uniform was dirty but mostly intact, not like some of the others. I approached him the same way I had all the others, with that hollow feeling in my gut. My job was to search him for anything of intelligence, value, maps, orders, that sort of thing. But it's a profound violation, you know, going through another man's pockets, even an enemy's. There's a strange, terrible intimacy to it. You're touching the last things he touched. You're rifling through the little pieces of his life he carried right next to his heart. I knelt down, the wet mud soaking through my trousers, and I made sure not to look at his face. I focused on his chest, his side. I unbuckled his gear, my fingers fumbling, cold and clumsy. And that's when I felt it, the familiar rectangular shape in his haversack. I pulled it out. A K-Ration box. The Americans had these marvels. We'd heard about them, joked about them with a kind of bitter envy. While we were chewing on our black bread, and worse, that was more sawdust than meat, the Yanks had these little cardboard treasure chests. This one was still full. He hadn't even opened it. I set the box aside for a moment and went through his pockets, my hands moving automatically. And that's when the detachment I'd so carefully built up began to crack. In his tunic pocket, over his heart, was a photograph. A girl, of course. Smiling with dark hair and a shy look in her eyes. She was pretty. Behind the photo, A letter, the paper soft from being folded and unfolded 100 times. I didn't read it, that felt like a step too far, but I could see the careful, looping handwriting. Then a small, worn St. Christopher medal. The same kind my own mother had pressed into my hand the day I left. I held these things in my palm, these simple, universal treasures, and my eyes, against all my orders, drifted up to his face. He was young, younger than me, I thought, maybe 18. There was no anger on his face, no hate, just a pale stillness, a few freckles across his nose. He looked like one of the boys from my village. And in that moment the propaganda, all the talk of monsters and subhumans and the enemy, just evaporated. This wasn't a faceless foe. This was a hungry young man who carried a picture of his girl and a letter from home and a saint's medal for protection. He was just like me. Packed this K-Ration that morning or the night before, thinking it was his next meal, fuel to get him through the day. He had no idea it would be his last. I looked from his still face to the ration box in my hand. My own stomach was a knot of emptiness. We'd been on the move since before dawn, and the sliver of sausage and hard bread in my pack had to last huck knew how long. The K-Ration felt heavy, a temptation. It felt wrong. It was his, but he didn't need it anymore. The dead don't get hungry. It was a brutal, pragmatic calculation, the kind you learn to make out here. To leave it would be wasteful, and waste could mean your own life, or the life of one of your kameraden. Still, I hesitated. Taking this felt different from taking a map or a code book. This was personal. This was his food. But the gnawing in my belly won out. I sat back on my heels, right there in the mud beside him, and I opened the box. The first thing I saw was the little pack of cigarettes, Lucky Strikes. Lucky, I thought with a grim irony. I set them aside. There was a bar of something dark brown, chocolate, real chocolate. I hadn't tasted real chocolate in years. There was a small can, and when I pried it open with my knife, it was full of a thick processed meat hash. It smelled rich, salty, fatty. There were also hard candies, biscuits, and even a tiny packet of instant coffee. It was a feast. I ate it right there. I used my finger to scoop out the hash. It was greasy and delicious, and I savored every bite. I broke the chocolate and let a piece melt on my tongue, the sweetness almost shocking. But the taste was forever linked to that place, to that boy lying next to me. It was a bittersweet fuel, a meal of ghosts. Each mouthful was a reminder of my own hunger, and of his, which would never be satisfied. I was eating his future, the life he should have had. I looked at his photograph, propped up against his haversack, and I felt like a thief. Worse than a thief. I was a scavenger. But as I sat there, the food putting a warmth back into my cold body, the realization settled on me with a weight heavier than any pack. This American, this enemy, he wasn't some abstract idea. He was a boy who missed his girl, who worried his mother, who probably liked baseball and a cold beer and joking with his friends. He packed this ration, hoping it would get him through to the next day, just like I did. We were on opposite sides of this godforsaken field, taught to hate each other, but in the end we were the same. Just men. Young men far from home, scared most of the time, sustained or broken by the same basic needs. A full belly, a letter from home, a picture to look at in the dark. The flags and the ideologies, they seemed so distant then, so meaningless compared to the simple, crushing reality of that field. I finished the meal and carefully put the photograph, the letter and the St. Christopher medal back in his pocket. I closed his haversack. It was the least I could do. I couldn't give him his life back, but I could give him that little bit of dignity. I stood up, my legs stiff, the silence feeling even deeper than before. The weight of what I'd done, of what I'd seen, settled on me. It wasn't just the weight of the food in my stomach, but the weight of a truth I couldn't unsee. I carried that with me for the rest of the war, long after the taste of that chocolate had faded. I carried the memory of that American boy's face, and the knowledge that when you strip it all away, the uniforms and the rifles and the hate, we were all just hungry, and we all just wanted to go home.